Hi everyone, my name is Karina Salcedo.
And I'm Jonathan Naylor. And this week we are focusing on Article 1 of the Constitution. Now this article specifically focuses on the legislative branch, or Congress, and kind of some of the powers that they have. Now one thing that's really important to focus on is that the Founding Fathers were very concerned about the powers that government should have, and then where the lines need to be drawn on where the limits need to be restricted. So this actually leads to the idea of small versus limited government. And in fact, a lot of people get these two very mixed up and they believe that they're the same thing. But actually, the founders intended for a limited government. And let me explain why. So when you talk about small, you're essentially talking about a government that has no power. However, the Constitution very clearly states things that the federal government needs to have, which actually is what makes it a limited or constitutional government. There's certain lines that it has to stay within. And it doesn't specify the size of the government, but specifies where it is allowed to have power. So an example of this is that we are supposed to have a military. This is supposed to actually be created in our Constitution. But there's 328 million people here in America. So the size of that military needs to be pretty large if it's going to protect that many people. So the Constitution authorizes this military, but it doesn't specify the size that it needs to be at. And obviously we can agree that to protect that many lives, it needs to be pretty substantial. Another example is post offices. I don't know about you, but I'm thankful that the post office that I go to is within the state, or within the city even, that I'm living in. And if I had a small government, I wouldn't be able to actually go to the post office if it was that far away. But there's over 31,000 post offices here in America, and that's one of the things that the Constitution actually gives the federal government the ability to do. And so that's kind of the idea of a limited government versus a smaller government. Now, some areas the government has involved itself in are actually nowhere to be found within the Constitution.
So let's talk about some of these areas. We've given you a general outline of the sections within Article 1 of the Constitution. We want to focus on 3 sections in particular. Section 8, which is the enumerated powers of Congress, what Congress is authorized or can do, the do's of Congress. Section 9, the don'ts of Congress, what Congress cannot do. And Section 10, which is the don'ts of the states. So let's take a look at Section 8 specifically. Within Section 8 lists exactly what Congress can do. So anything that Congress can do is going to be in Section 8. If Congress does anything outside of what Section 8 lists, it's unconstitutional. So you may have read Section 8 by now, I hope you have, and may have thought, well, where does Congress get this power and that power? Well, unfortunately, the government has found ways to manipulate specific clauses within the section and interpreted them in such a way to give them more power. There's 3 specific clauses. It's the necessary and proper, general welfare, and the commerce clause. We're going to talk about the general welfare and the necessary and proper, and I'll talk more about the commerce clause in your Constitution Simplified. So make sure to follow along with that as well. But let's talk about the general welfare clause. It's very interesting. So I'm going to go ahead and read Article 1, Section 8 for you. It says, the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States, but all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States. So they take this idea of general welfare where they can tax you, because really anything can be interpreted to be for your general welfare, right? But no, there's not a period within this specific clause. General welfare is referring to, if you look, you have to take everything into context. What was the rest of the clause saying? The clause was saying that these taxes need to be structured in order to pay the debts and to provide for the common defense. So essentially, general welfare means it has to be something that everyone benefits from. Sometimes there's the federal government tax people based off of needed bridges or needed things that don't necessarily provide for everyone. And that would, in that case, be unconstitutional. James Madison said that it would have been impossible for the Constitution to have been passed if general welfare meant unlimited taxes. He literally said this. So that is evident that there are restrictions to how the government can tax you. And the restrictions are right there in the Constitution.
What's interesting though is that, like she said, we can claim almost anything is for the general welfare. An example of this actually boils down to almost the founding of America, where they were trying to determine whether or not the federal government should bail out private industries. And the reason for this was, well, if a company is so big and so large that its demise could actually cripple the economy of the United States, is it in the federal government's jurisdiction to bail them out for the general welfare? And And so actually, if we look at the notes of the Constitutional Convention, which are public record and you can in fact find them, in 1792 they had what was called the Codfish Bill. And it was a bill to bail out the largest private business in Massachusetts because it would cripple the economy, which would be harmful to the general welfare. In case you didn't know, when America was first founded, fishing was actually one of the biggest industries that they had. And so this was bailing out, essentially the idea of bailing out Google or Apple of today. This was what they were looking at. And James Madison said that if Congress can employ money to the general welfare indefinitely, they can make everything fall under the guise of the Constitution. Now listen to this. If you don't believe the Founding Fathers were prophetic, I'd like you to listen to the examples he gave of where the federal government might go if we try to interpret general welfare. So first he talked about the idea of religion. He said that if we talk about general welfare, that might be something that the government may get itself involved in. Secondly, he talked about education. He believed that the federal government should not be playing a role in education, purely for the sake of that's too broad a power, that's too much power the federal government can have.
And interestingly enough, in the Constitution, we never read anything about a Department of Education, but continue.
Exactly. The third thing he talked about was public roads. He said that, well, in Article 1, Section 8, it actually talks about building post roads. But if the federal government starts building all of the roads, that might be too much power. That might be something that they're going to start levying taxes for purely because it might be seen as that. And then the fourth one was the idea of the poor. He said that the federal government should have no job in actually bailing out the poor. Instead, they believed in personal responsibility in that regard. And so what he thought was that if we do not stop, Congress is going to be in charge of everything that we have in America. Essentially, there will be no power left to the states if we continue down this idea of choosing general welfare. And keep in mind that I know some of these things sound positive, but their fear was essentially the federal government being so powerful that we no longer had control over our own lives. Now let's talk about the next clause that the federal government has tried to interpretate.
So within Section 8 of the Constitution, under Article 1, the last clause within that section mentions this idea of necessary and proper. It has been constantly misinterpreted by lawmakers, trying to find ways to literally make any power that's necessary and proper to carry out their intentions, essentially. Let's see and examine why this isn't correct. So let's read the language from the Constitution that mentions this idea. So it says, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. So I emphasize the word foregoing within there because it is very important, and it kind of lays out the framework that this necessary and proper power was supposed to be established under. So foregoing, the definition of foregoing in the dictionary is literally just mentioned or stated. So in order to understand what the framers meant by necessary and proper, we need to look to the clause before the necessary and proper clause. Let's read that one. It says, to exercise the exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district not exceeding 10 miles square, as may by cession of particular states and by the acceptance of Congress become the seat of government of the United States, and to exercise like authority over all places purchased by the consent of the legislature of the state in which the same shall be for the erection of forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings. And then it goes into the necessary and proper clause. So essentially, there wasn't a period within the necessary and proper clause. It said foregoing. It said foregoing if you keep reading it. What was mentioned before in that clause that I just read are all the powers that Congress is allowed to execute necessary and proper powers. So essentially, I'm going to give you an example. So within that clause that I just read you, the one before necessary and proper, it gives Congress the power to build forts, right? So in order to build forts, you need to buy the materials, you need to hire people. So essentially what it's saying is that Congress has the power to carry out the powers that we've already listed. They obviously need to buy the materials, they obviously need to hire these individuals, and obviously this is just one example, but we see how far we've strayed from the actual interpretation of the necessary and proper clause today. And so essentially, if we didn't, all of this to say that if we did not take it away from the states and grant it to the Constitution, then the government cannot do it.
Exactly. And so the idea of this is that I think we've shown the founders pored over every detail of this Constitution because they had a real distrust of power. In fact, they did not want to make it solely able to do whatever is necessary and proper because that would be too much power in government. And in fact, they based this off of Jeremiah 17:9, which talks about the wickedness of man and the fact that basically man was created fallen. And so this was the basis for why they had the separation of powers, both among the federal government and the state government, but also among the judiciary, the legislative, and the executive. They distrusted the government purely because they distrusted man. And each branch actually has weapons of self-defense in case of an overreaching branch because they understood that men are not perfect. The Constitution is very much alive today. However, it's in critical condition if we do not educate ourselves on what makes this beautiful document so great. Now join us next week as we delve into the executive branch or the president and the judicial branch and the Supreme Court.